So, okay, cool. So we hold these Learn at Lunch webinars approximately once a month to highlight issues pertaining to rural and urban forestry. Today is the first Learn at Lunch webinar of 2019. Meridith McAvoy Perkins is the former state urban and community forestry coordinator for the state of Utah. She was in that position when I began with USU back in 2014, and she was one of the people responsible for getting the Learn at Lunch webinar program up and running. So thank you, Meridith. Currently, Meridith is an urban forester and Missouri regional manager for Davey Resource Group. She is an ISA certified arborist, municipal specialist, and qualified tree risk assessor. That's why I asked her to present on this important topic today. I'm thrilled that she said yes, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meridith. I'm also going to have a little bit of information about CEUs. So, sorry, I forgot to write that down, but I'm just going to go through it really quickly. If you want CEUs for today's webinar, you should have seen that in the registration form for the webinar, there's a new section to enter your CEU information. And so please make sure that you enter your CEU identification number in the registration form. We're not using the Google Sheet anymore on the Google form. It's just much more streamlined to do it this way. So with that, go ahead, Meridith, and I will mute myself and be in the background.
All right, thank you so much, Megan. It is wonderful to be back in Utah, at least here virtually. It is amazing to see where the webinar series has gone. You guys have taken it and run with it. I remember the days when we were excited to just have 20 people learning about our Big Tree program. So to have this kind of attendance is exceptional, and hopefully we can get through some good information here today. Megan asked me to talk about trees and tree risk, and that was something that was really of interest to the webinar following here. And so that's kind of where we're going to take it. I'm going to jump right in. I'll come back to this big elm tree here a little bit later on in the program, but all right, hold on, I got to see.
So if it's not advancing, you might just need to click on the screen and then use your arrow keys.
Okay, I think I'm okay.
There you go, got it.
I got to work my double slides here, my double screens. Okay, before we talk about risk, it's always critical to talk about why we have trees. This is something that is universal within the green industry. I think I start every presentation I ever had with you know, why trees are good. We have bumper stickers that say trees are good. We have websites about trees are good. We have so much emerging science and research talking about why trees are good. And so we always want to be reminded about why we go through the practice of planting trees, why we are promoting trees as an industry, because they're really important. They're really important for our communities. They're really important for our kids. They're really important for our well-being overall. So I could dive in and spend an hour just talking about all the benefits of trees, but that's not what we're here today to do. So I just want to remind you about that. And as we start talking about risk, we always want to keep that in the back of our minds that, you know, trees are good and we can calculate a lot of those good resources, good reasons why. But ultimately, it's a risk worth taking when we start looking at trees in our landscapes. Okay, so this is kind of where we land once we get to, you know, when we really start thinking about tree risk, the idea that trees are risky. And when we see these kinds of news articles, I just pulled a couple of these off of the internet when I was putting the talk together, and you'll see them every once in a while. People dying, people getting damaged, close calls, and it's natural for every human being to question trees in the landscape at this point. It's totally natural to be a little more uncomfortable and feel vulnerable in our decisions. I know here in St. Louis and in Missouri, when we have big snowstorms or big ice storms, I think back and I cross my fingers that those trees that I have given another day to stay and have said, you know what, this tree has a low risk or moderate risk, that in those particular instances, that those trees are going to actually hold up. So we question those things all of the time. I think it's important to note that the reason why these are in the news is because it doesn't happen very often. The headlines make really great, gripping information for the news anchors to kind of catch your attention. Healthy trees falling all over the city, damaging power lines. They don't say the 362 other times out of the year, healthy trees standing and providing all of these great services and ecosystem benefits to our community. So balancing out the fact that these are really limited occurrences is something to keep in mind. We're not talking about a public safety crisis here, but we are talking about something really significant. Tree risk is something that we know exists, and the damage can be pretty substantial. So we need to know that it is there, and we need to work through how to manage for it. So I wanted to launch just a quick poll here, and kind of get a read on who's here on this program, and see who has actual experience with tree damage, tree failure that's causing a damage. So I think that Megan is going to launch that poll up, and hopefully I'll be able to see the response. The picture that you see here is one of my very first experiences with tree risk. I was doing a tree inventory on a college campus, and I was about halfway through when one morning I came up to campus to start collecting data, and this tree had fallen and crushed this Civic. And I have to admit, it was a very startling experience for me. That tree was a huge, probably 32-inch red oak tree, full healthy canopy. Everything about it looked great. Obviously, there were some issues with the roots and the site, and it really shook me as far as how to kind of regulate where I was in identifying tree risk, because in all practical purposes, this tree wouldn't have necessarily come on a radar for a high or severe risk tree.
So Meredith, I'm gonna give people 3 more seconds to enter their answers.
Okay, and I'm not seeing the actual.
Yeah. It'll come up, and once I end the polling, then it'll come up. So
okay, great.
330 people have voted of 419. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it now. Share results. Can you see that?
Yes. So this is exactly what I was kind of expecting. So according to the poll, it's about 50% of you have had some risk associated with a work event. And I assume that many of you are working in cities or as arborists, and so are dealing with those, have been responding to those types of calls. And that drives a lot of our tree risk management. When we have those personal experiences, we can make different assumptions, or it rattles us differently. Some people have had tree risk damage personally. I'm sorry for that. That's also one of my worst nightmares. Arborist car gets struck by a tree. A couple of folks had neighbors or friends, and 10% have never had any kind of tree risk.
Meredith, I probably should have put the option in there, all 3, because I'm having some people say like all 3. So
yeah, right, sure. So there is that where people, when you become connected as a industry professional, likely you'll have a number of these will kind of hit home for you. But what I wanted to point out in this, with this question and this slide, is that our personal experiences do sometimes drive how we look at risk. I was talking with a doctor friend of mine who, we were talking about how there's so many tests now with diagnosing any kind of illness. And she said that really the thing that drives a lot of doctors to over-test is having one negative outcome. So if there's a negative outcome that they have said, oh, this person's fine, and they aren't, then all of a sudden they start thinking a lot more along the lines of, I want to test every single possible thing. And in the tree world, we just can't do that. We can't test every tree for every possible defect or every possible problem. But what we need to do is kind of take our experience and take the industry protocols and turn it into a way for us to really be proactive about tree risk. So when Megan originally asked me to talk about this, my initial response was, why do people keep asking for tree risk? There are innumerable amounts of resources out there for you all. And many of you, I recognize on the check-in list here, many of you are probably practicing and have a lot of these resources at your fingertips. But there's BMPs, there's technical papers, there's webinars that are out there right now that you can Google that will give you a lot of detailed information about tree risk. So as I was sort of formulating what we should talk about here this afternoon, I started thinking about why we keep asking for this training and what we really need to talk about. So the program today will really cover my assumptions on what the answer to that question is, and they're kind of laid out here. So I think liability is one of the main things that people that I work with are concerned about when it comes to tree risk. We have to cover our assets, right? So we've got to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, that we understand the financial risks associated with doing or not doing certain things when it comes to trees. Tree risk assessments are in demand. We want to do them right. The industry, our arboricultural industry, continues to grow and train our arborists in the right kinds of protocols, and the professional development within the industry. People want to make sure that we're answering the questions and providing clients and cities and the public the right kind of information that's going to help make the best decisions when it comes to tree risk. Tree risk management can be confusing. I think once we start getting tree assessments and we know there's risk out there, we know we can even prioritize risk, we can move things around, but what does that mean from a management perspective? I'll try and touch on that a little bit and kind of help you understand what's going on out there and what some possibilities are. And I think people are interested in risk too because the stories are interesting. We hear a lot about, the child that gets killed at the public park, or the big news making problems that really rattle everyone, whether they're in the tree industry or not. But we want to learn from somebody else's mistakes. We want to make sure that we're not going to be the next headline. So kind of learning from those stories and taking something away to incorporate into our own practice and into our own programs. And then finally, I think this is really the take home, is that everybody wants to sleep better. We want to know that the trees that we're responsible for are going to maximize their public benefits. We're going to get as much as we can out of them. We're going to be able to enjoy them without having to worry that they're going to become a liability and become a problem for us, for our community, for our clients. So what can we do to reduce that risk overall so that we can continue to be promoting tree planting and canopy growth? So that's kind of it in a nutshell, and I'm going to kind of jump through things. I also want to encourage those of you that have been practicing with tree risk and have particular experience, probably have even maybe more knowledge on some of this stuff than I do. If you're just kind of logging in for CEUs and have something to add, feel free to throw it up there in the chat pod, and we can kind of have a little bit of back and forth with some of that stuff. All right, liability, that's where I want to start, and it kind of drives home a lot of the part of what we practice. Disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not qualified to give any legal advice. There are a lot of multi-day programs on tree law The Arbor Day Foundation hosted some a while back. Different state agencies will have regular trainings on tree risk and tree law. So this is going to be a brief flash in the pan of some terminology, but it's a very complex process. But really it comes down to negligence. A person is negligent when he or she fails to act reasonably. Those are kind of the key words. Are we acting reasonably in what we're doing when it comes to trees? And that can vary depending on who we are, if we're a homeowner or if we're a professional or if we're a city manager. But when there is some kind of event, a tree failure, those words come out a lot. Was there negligence? Were people acting reasonably and prudent? So I always come back to that terminology when I'm thinking through tree risk. I also want to point out the duty of care. Tree owners have a duty of care to maintain their trees. If you have a tree, whether it's on your private property or it's in a city that you manage or a client's property that you manage, our own duty of care is to maintain trees on the property, and we have a duty to inspect them to make sure that if there are defects, if there's known defects, we can prevent that we can prevent injury for other people. As professionals, we have to do that. We're held to a higher standard of duty of care, because when we do that inspection, we have a better understanding of what kinds of defects might be relevant and might cause other tree failures and cause injuries. So as a professional, we need to follow appropriate professional practice. That's one of the reasons why we have these standards, is so that we can all say, yep, this is the standard and we're following it. If we deviate from that standard, if we don't do something that's typical that another arborist would do, then we're not true to our professional duty of care, and that can come back in a liability case. So we need to obey all the existing laws, regulations, codes. We have to be professional in our conduct. We have to be reasonable in our approach to assessments, and we have to follow the standards that are set out in the industry. If we do that, then we're moving in the right direction. I put this link to the NOLO Press neighbor law on there. It has a lot of great information just on kind of who's responsible for what. If this is your first kind of experience with tree law and you're just interested in, whose insurance pays for what and why, you might want to check out that NOLO Press. Just Google it. They have a book, but also kind of a lot of Q&A on there that can shed light on some of that stuff. But ultimately, liability drives a lot of our decisions with risk, but it's not always a rhyme or reason to what one person decides based on liability might be something completely different for another person or another manager. So what we're hoping, I think, with tree risk management overall is to get us all more on the same playing field with understanding when we can keep trees in the landscape, that we don't have to cut down every tree, that there's a process and a protocol. And when we start determining if a tree has a moderate risk rating, that's not something that we're going to need to, eliminate out of the landscape. So when we start looking at risk, the ANSI standards, the American National Standards, just updated in 2017, the tree risk assessment protocols. And I just want to briefly touch on the 3 different levels of risk assessment that are out there. Level 1 is a limited visual assessment. That's typically, some people will do a windshield survey. It's typically a one-sided, quick, rapid assessment of a large group of trees. So if you're, in charge of keeping up with a particular inventory or resource, limited visual assessment is often a fine way to just make sure you're not missing anything. kind of keep up with things as they evolve, because, you know, something could be totally normal, and then the next minute you might have a higher risk tree in your mix. So it's just a quick, rapid response in that level 1. The level 2 assessment is a more basic. It's probably the most common that we see, where you're taking a 360-degree visual evaluation from the ground. You may use a sounding mallet, a probe to look into some defects and determine how deep some of the cavities are. But this is going to be a single tree, 360, look up in the canopy, look at the trunk, think about the roots, think about the site, and then give an evaluation based on that. If what you are looking at, if a level 2 sparks some particular questions, you see something up in the canopy, something doesn't make sense, and this tree has there's a particular interest in protecting the tree, or coming to a really specific conclusion about this risk, then a level 3 or an advanced assessment is probably appropriate. And that's where we start looking at putting a climber up in the canopy to do some assessments and look at the structural integrity of the branching in the canopy. We look at drilling in and testing the density of the trunk tissue, doing some tomography, root excavations, the resistograph, aeration on the soil or around the soil to look at root structure. So all of those additional, more advanced techniques would be lumped into that level 3. And kind of going back to that medical example, those are going to be a lot more expensive. Those added tests are going to give you more certainty about what's going on with the tree, but they sometimes aren't necessary in determining what the risk is. So as you start kind of thinking through the priority of what kind of level risk assessment you're going to need, you can kind of see, okay, am I going to get what I need out of that level 2? And that level 3 is going to be reserved for when you really need to be on point with the recommendations. Okay, so once we decide we're doing the risk assessment, what exactly is it that we're looking for? I pulled this little blip off of a Davey training video from RJ Laverne, so thanks RJ. But what we're looking for, we're assessing the tree, and the tree risk truth number 1, tree failure is most often associated with a structural defect or the loss of wood strength. So when we're assessing our trees, we're looking at, what's abnormal about this tree, what's going on with it that, is potentially going to create a vulnerability in the structural integrity of the tree. Tree risk number 2, and I think this is a really key one, is that the actual event of a tree failure is frequently triggered by an external force, something coming in, a wind event, an ice event, even a climber putting a line up in the tree and pulling. So, what causes the tree to actually fail is something to keep in mind. And then tree risk truth number 3, most tree failure events occur when truth 1 and truth 2 come together. You have a defect, you have a problem within the structural integrity of the tree, and then you have an event that puts enough force on that to create a problem. I was looking through some different webinars actually that the USU Extension hosted, and there is one from Dr. Kozer and the Tree Fund back in 2017, which I thought was excellent. So I encourage you all to go through that. And some of his examples, some of his research was noting that as an industry, we're really quite good at identifying defects in trees. We're quite good at identifying problems that would create structural issues within the trees, but we're not as good at thinking through some of the other risk issues, like the likelihood of failure impacting something or the consequence of that tree failing. And those drive a lot of our risk assessments as well. So, you know, as a professional, we can hone our skills in it, understanding the tree biology, understanding what's going on, you know, with this system as a whole, but looking at, you know, what's going to happen if this shingle oak crushes this small bungalow house, the consequence of that failure or the likelihood of it happening. Those are things that we're continuing to evolve and improve within ourselves personally as evaluators, and I think as a industry in how we can get on the same page with some of those things. So what makes a tree risk is not only the defects, the likelihood of those defects failing and the consequence associated with that tree failing. So I wanted to put this other poll up here. A tree with a severe defect is always a severe risk.
So Meredith, something happened with that poll, so we're just going to have to pretend like it's there, but we can.
I already have a good answer. Well, not from this group, but I posed this question to a group of 25 community college students in my urban forestry class last fall. They had sat through a 3-hour tree risk class with a leading track trainer, Skip Kincaid, who's excellent. And they learned all the things that many of you already know. They learned all the things that we're going to talk about on this short webinar. And after all of that, the next quiz, the following week, I asked them this true or false question. A tree with a severe defect is always a severe risk. 50% of them still responded true. So it's something that we have to really pay attention to, because when we see severe defect, we think severe risk. But if there is no target and there is no consequence, the risk is quite low. That target really matters. This was a tree that failed in my neighborhood park. It's a hackberry tree. The branch just broke out of it. There was included bark. It's in a very open area of the park that nobody really pays much attention to. No one's playing soccer there. Nobody's walking their dog there. So the branch fell, and it was unfortunate, but the risk associated with that and the damage caused by that failure was pretty minimal. This is a tulip tree, small tulip tree, but it has a significant amount of included bark, and it's right here next to a parking lot. This is at that same community college. As this tree grows and gets bigger in diameter, and those branches get bigger, and that included bark starts pushing against itself, and a branch potentially falls out of that tree and lands on one of these cars, the consequence of that failure is going to be quite higher. So the total risk rating for a tree that's growing next to a parking lot is going to be a lot higher than a tree that's growing out in an open area of a park that isn't getting used. Another thing that we need to take into consideration when we start looking at risk overall is the site conditions. Again, we're really good at looking at a tree and answering questions about what's going on, what do I see, what's my visual assessment on this tree. But as an arborist, we're also investigators in a way. We have to ask a lot of questions about what's going on the site to better anticipate what kinds of impacts we can be looking forward to. In this particular case, this tree just fell over on a calm day. The wind, prevailing wind is actually coming in the opposite direction of the tree failure. And when we came up on it, the tree, the hole where the tree was pulled out was just a puddle of water. And as I started talking with the homeowner, we started to get to the bottom of what's going on, what happened. The home right behind this homeowner's house was a newly established home. Behind this brick wall is a swimming pool. The swimming pool has some kind of a steady leak. The water continues to puddle in this area and has been slowly saturating that soil for the past year. And so we don't have all of the information yet. I just took these photos a couple of weeks ago, but when we know what's going on, when we know that there are problems associated with the site drainage, or we know that there has been root damage involved with this particular area, or we know that a tree is vulnerable to emerging insects and disease problems that we might not necessarily be able to catch right out of the gate. But understanding that, also understanding what kinds of winds, in Utah, one of the big problems that we were seeing was canyon winds, strong canyon winds coming down. So a defect that may not be a problem in a group of trees might be more of a problem in a standalone tree that's subjected to really strong down canyon winds. So, it's just, we really have to take a holistic approach to risk and looking at how all of those different site conditions could play. One of my unfortunate events in risk assessment, I was out looking at the state champion hackberry. This was, again, early on in my career here in St. Louis. And this hackberry was spectacular. This woman had people come and look at it. She had it pruned regularly. She took the best care of it. And everything about it looked great. I measured it for the state championship. I, approved all of her paperwork. And the next maybe season, the entire tree uprooted. And what she hadn't told me was that area started flooding, and that she had a lot of water down in this area where the hackberry had been growing, which was great for the tree itself. The canopy was really vibrant. The wood tissue was growing great, but eventually the root rot got to it and the tree went over. So sometimes you have to learn those lessons the hard way. The tree risk assessment form is really important. When we start doing these types of assessments, it's critical that we keep track of what's going on. So when we're looking at an individual tree, we want to fill out all the paperwork associated with that. And we don't have to fill out an entire tree risk assessment form from the ISA. This is a standard, and it's a great resource and tool, but we have to have consistent ways that we're identifying and assessing risk, and we have to keep track of that, so that then if there ever is a problem, we have the paperwork to back up exactly why we did what we did. When I was looking back at my presentation archives to pull a risk webinar together, when Megan asked me, I was like, oh yeah, I've got one of those already, and I pulled up an old one from probably 15 years ago, and in that training and that teaching, I think it was for a certified arborist class, we were teaching really the quantitative way to do tree risk assessment. So the Forest Service originally had developed a number system, a numeric system for risk rating, and it took into consideration the failure potential. So kind of what are the defects, how bad is the problem. I looked at the size of the part. So a small tree is more risky, we're going to be more problematic than a large tree. Sorry, vice versa. Small tree is less of a risk than a big tree. It's going to be more of an impact. And then what would it be hitting the target? So we would give all of those numeric ratings and come up with a number, 1 through 12. And so when I would give that to a manager, they could see, oh, my tree is a 10, or this tree is only a 4, or whatever it is. We've evolved that rating to be more qualitative, where we're using words like here in this risk matrix: unlikely, very unlikely, moderate, probable, possible, impossible. And although they seem vague, when I first kind of made that transition, it just seemed a little bit nebulous, but the protocols are really quite specific, and it gives a lot more flexibility to the decision makers who are making the choice on whether or not they're going to take that risk with the tree. what they're going to do with it, they have a lot more leeway to look at that likelihood of impact, the likelihood of failure, the consequences, and weigh all of the different options. Tree risk assessment protocol is TRAC. That's what you'll start hearing thrown around a lot now. That is the ISA protocol that most industry standard is moving toward. But there are other options out there, I suppose. But that really is the terminology and the way to kind of what we're seeing the industry evolve into. I'm interested to know, as this group of professionals who are participating today, if you're familiar with the TRAC protocol. If this is something new, I think we as arborists sometimes put our heads down and think everybody knows all of this stuff. But I'm interested to know who on this call is aware of it. Oh, and you know what? I have the wrong questions in here, but Megan's pulled.
That's okay. I figured it out. Just so you know, we're in 37 minutes in, so I just wanted to give you
Oh my gosh, I'm going to talk. Okay, I'm going to skip.
No worries. But people are voting right now, so I'm going to give them 3 more seconds to enter your vote.
While they're entering, I'm going to skip down because I definitely want to get into allowing some questions, and I want to give you some examples. Okay. This is an example of a level 3 risk assessment, and it was a product of a stage. So there's a prominent stage, theatrical stage here in St. Louis that has a backdrop with this beautiful bur oak. It's a 44-inch diameter bur oak, and as you can see, I think you can see my pointer, it's growing behind the stage, and it's been there for 100 years or more, and a beloved asset to the stage. They're redoing the entire stage, and they wanted to protect this tree. So they had us come out and do everything that we could to determine the risk of the tree. We did a resistograph, some readings of the tree itself, and also below ground in some of the root flares. We put a climber up in the tree to do an aerial inspection. And ultimately, after we did all of these things, the tree came out as being very stable. It still had a risk, but the risk was low enough that the managers felt really confident having this tree as part of their infrastructure. The problem with it is that then once they started adding on the construction elements and talking about how they could protect the tree around all of the different construction activities that were going on, ultimately the tree had to come out because it was so isolated there in the landscape that the risk rating was moderate. It was moderate as is, but as soon as we start changing some of the impacts on that tree, the risk rating goes up, and then it became to the point where once they were going to the things that they would have to do in order to upgrade the stage would be so detrimental that the tree would not be able to maintain. So that was a heartbreak, but it was great to see people really wanting to protect a tree, and the risk assessment protocol supported protecting the tree. I think when we start looking at the TRAC program, it does help us justify saving trees more, whereas the numeric program or the protocols often, I think it led to more trees getting removed than maybe necessarily needed to be. I'm just looking at the response from the poll, and it looks like 71% were familiar with the TRAC protocol, so that's kind of what I was expecting, and that's great. But still 30% need more information on that. So I encourage you to look into it, especially if you're doing risk assessments. It's something that you'll want to be aware of. I also wanted to point out that the reason why we went through and we sort of transitioned to that probable possible matrix that's the language of the legal system. And that's also the language of a lot of our public works. I was sitting through a public works workshop on risk associated with bridges and sidewalks and all of those things. And they use that same terminology. So as an industry, if we want to stay relevant with urban planning, engineering, those kinds of, where trees are going to be in the landscape, we have to be able to talk the talk with those industries and organizations. And track really gets us closer to the end game with that. This is just a quick slide. I just wanted to point out that sometimes when you make a decision as a manager, document exactly why you made that choice. Sometimes, and this has happened to me before, you make a choice that the risk is not that the risk is not tolerable. It's not an acceptable risk for a particular defect or a particular target or particular incident. And so you remove the tree, and then people come by and they look at that tree and they say, well, that tree was completely solid. Everything about that tree looks great. Why did you cut it down? And so really being able to justify the choice, whether it is to protect the tree or remove the tree, is going to give everybody a lot more information, because so much of tree removal and tree protection is emotional. So as professionals, if we can remove that emotion a little bit and we can say, look, here are the facts, this is what we saw, this is why we made this choice, it de-escalates so much of that conversation and the buzz around the decisions, and really shows that, you as a professional or you as a manager listening to a professional had information and made the best choice you could. Sometimes you'll get a completely rotted stump and everyone's like, yep, I told you so. And sometimes, you'll have the defect won't even be visible. Sometimes you'll make a case because there's a suspected root damage and that tree might have been able to compartmentalize and stay in the landscape longer. But documenting that information and making sure you have it attached to those different sites and ready is going to be real important if anybody ever calls you to task on that. If you need more information, Purdue Extension has a great little tree risk fact sheet. The ISA risk assessment qualification course is available throughout the country. They have a great cadre of professionally trained track certifying folks that will come and do the training and give you that certification if you're a certified arborist. And then Nebraska just posted a online risk workshop with Mark Dunneman, which I haven't had the time to go through in total, but it looks like a very robust tree risk attack. So if you have the time and you have the interest, I'd encourage you to check out some of those resources to kind of brush up on anything that might be limited as far as tree assessments. No tree is safe. That is, I think, the overarching tree risk reality. We never say, oh yeah, that tree is safe, or oh, if you do X, Y, and Z, your tree will be safe, because we see healthy trees come down. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. And we can't possibly know everything that might be going on supporting that tree. This is a big McBain bur oak along the Katy Trail here in Missouri, and it's a beloved tree, and it is super old, and people come from all over to look at it. But branches, can come out of that tree at any time, and we still encourage people to recreate there, and the arborist community does a great job of pruning it and trying to mitigate risks associated with it. But ultimately, what we need to consider is, what is our acceptable risk? The tree owner or the tree manager, at the end of the day, is responsible for making that choice. So where everybody's acceptable risk is going to vary depending on what your perspective is and what your influences are. But all of this, small trees with, minimal consequences, minimal defects, they're all going to be in this acceptable risk. When we start really having questions is when we start getting into these yellow and orange and red categories, where we think, okay, where are we willing to risk it? Once we get to the red, the severe risk is kind of a no-brainer too. But kind of that middle zone is hard, and we have to weigh a lot of options. I won't spend time on this too much, but I think as an industry, we don't realize how much risk we take in everyday stuff. I just bought my children a trampoline for Christmas. My husband works in an emergency room, and he about lost it. And we had a really important conversation around what is our individual risk. And I say all the benefits of activity, all the fun, all of the safety precautions, I justified why I wanted to take that risk, even though he sees broken clavicles and, kids getting stepped on all the time or whatever, going through springs. With trampolines, we were able to balance that out and say, you know what, there is a risk, but the pros outweigh the risks. And so I won that argument. Cities also take a lot of risks. This took me a long time to recognize and to understand. When we're kind of focused just on our trees and managing our tree resource, it's hard sometimes to think about all the other risks that municipal governments take for their community betterment. If we're looking at some attributes that are improving our quality of life, we're looking at an asset that is going to help with our health and our well-being and our children's education, all of those things. There is an acceptable risk associated with some of those things. When we think about swimming pools, I have all the stats for this and I won't go through it, but there's innumerable amounts of risks associated with public swimming pools and drownings every year. Yet we continue to see more and more investments in municipal swimming pools, which I also love. Just crossing the street, I was diving into this Dangerous by Design 2019 form that I think it just came out maybe this month or last month, but it has some great statistics about how our cities are designed and what kind of risk we take every day just when we start talking about walkability in a community, increasing pedestrian traffic, what happens to the number of deaths associated with people getting hit by cars or, so forth, being exposed to different elements. So trees are part of our city's risk, but sometimes public managers aren't willing to accept the risk, though minor that it is, of our trees, and are willing to accept a lot of these other risks. So I think putting it into perspective in those contexts and those conversations is really critical to supporting tree risk or tree canopy overall, instead of veering the opposite direction, what I know some cities do, where they just eliminate trees in the right of way altogether. There's definitely a balance there. Balancing the risk and reward. This goes back to those notes down there. The links down at the bottom are some great sites for being able to calculate risks, calculate benefits, look at a lot of the emerging research and science on what trees are giving back to our communities. But with every pro, there could be a con. We look at the Forest Service study by Jeffrey Donovan on the loss of ash trees in communities and how that's associated with a significant number of deaths across 15 cities versus the Kent State study that looking at what are the wind-related events associated with tree failures that cause mortality. Anytime we're talking about people getting injured, it's unfortunate, and I would love to be able to mitigate all of that, but we need to look at what the risk and the reward is. And when we start looking at the reward associated with trees, I think we'll find that it does outweigh some of the risks that are out there and some of the misconceptions about what kind of risk that is. We need to be aware, we need to be reasonable, and we need to be consistent as an industry We need to make sure that we're following these standards. And if you look at, this is the track protocol, and if you look at how the matrix really comes together, the real extreme and high impacts are everything has to really come in line to equal an extreme or a high risk. So, you know, like I was saying before, we really have a lot of opportunity to save trees in the landscape that maybe people are worried about for a slightly less reasonable reason. I want to get into a couple of examples here for how we evaluate or how we utilize these risk ratings and manage tree inventories work. I won't read through all of this, but basically the example is that in the city of Elgin, they had a lot of problem with their trees failing when they had a storm. You know, they had a big 70-mile-an-hour windstorm hit the city and lots of trees were down, lots of problems happened. They had an inventory in 2010 that identified a lot of the defects that we know the defects associated with a wind event can cause those failures. So they went in and they systematically removed the severe and high risk trees that they needed to in order to minimize their risk. And then after they had done that work, they had another wind event and it had a much more positive experience or response. When tree inventories are done, street tree inventories in particular, typically the managers are given some kind of an assessment on where their trees rank. And it's pretty easy then to say, okay, if we want to remove our extreme and high risk trees, that's really just the low hanging fruit. So once you get past that, then managers have a lot of opportunity to look at what they want to manage for and start proactively addressing some of those concerns. Citizen complaints sometimes do work also. This tree was included in a 2017 street tree inventory as a good condition, healthy tree. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the homeowners around this tree called the city and said, hey, this tree's dropping branches. We think it's a problem. The city came out. They had a consulting arborist come out, take a look at the tree and make an assumption, make a determination on the risk and the condition of the tree. And the tree had just spiraled into being a poor quality tree overall, high hypoxylin, and it was suffering from a lot of secondary insects and borers. So ultimately, now the city has a professional's opinion that they can give to the resident. In this particular city, the resident's responsible for trees in the right of way. So now the city can enforce their safety protocols associated with trees thanks to that whole process. Sometimes citizen complaints don't always work, and I wanted to make sure that I touched on this, that just because a citizen calls doesn't mean that there's a huge risk. This was the tree at the front of the beginning of my slide. It's one of my favorite trees in my neighborhood. And just this past summer, late summer, a resident called in and was concerned about this branch. We have been monitoring it. I've been loving this tree for years, my whole life probably, and monitoring it as a professional for a significant amount of time. And ultimately, all it took was one neighbor saying that they were worried, and the city came through and removed a huge sweeping branch of this Scotch elm that just kind of shook the neighborhood and changed the character of the tree. So if we had some risk assessment associated with that and given the city a little bit more ability to come back to that concerned citizen and say, hey, this is what we're looking at, it should be fine. That give and take is always important. Shout out to the city of Provo for their elm tree that was propped up. I won't go into a lot of risk mitigation today, but there's a lot of ways if you're concerned about tree risk to fence off tree areas, remove the target to help keep the tree in the landscape. I'm going to skip this poll. and just jump into a couple of things. You know, the more we talk about risk, the more I think what we actually need to do is minimize our risk. Goes back to sleeping better at night. We need to change our practices and how we grow trees and how we manage trees in our urban spaces so that we don't create the risks in the first place. Gary Johnson has great studies on risk associated with sidewalk policies, and when we do these egregious practices and shave off all of the tree roots, how that changes the likelihood of those trees blowing over in an event. So I encourage you to look that up. There's a lot of good information associated with that, but ultimately we need to stop doing this. We need to do better when it comes to trees and construction. Once this is all cleaned up and an arborist comes out and looks at that tree 5 years later, we don't necessarily know all the impacts that have happened to that root structure. And that tree could be a lot more risky than we can anticipate. So we need to improve the construction practices as a municipal, agency. We need to really have stronger ordinances and different things that can support protecting our trees and keeping them intact so that their structural integrity isn't masked by infill dirt and come back to haunt us later. Mina Besuk just did a webinar here in this program talking about trees and construction. So if you didn't check that out, that's another good one to look into. Proactive maintenance, doing structural pruning on small trees is really critical to avoiding those defects down the road. The defects that we know then increase the likelihood of failure for trees. And then just kind of block side pruning and proactive pruning. Once you get through that high risk and severe risk management, looking at managing your tree resource on a proactive basis will really eliminate a lot of the challenges and the risk. Ash trees, I'm gonna go through this. I'm just gonna say, watch out, Utah. This is a picture on the right from Detroit. I was just there in 2017. This on the left is a picture from St. Louis in 2018. And maybe in another 2 years or so, I'll put one in for Salt Lake City. But we need to manage our ash trees proactively because that's a risk that we're going to start seeing exponentially along our street trees here in the Midwest for certain, and definitely in other areas. We will always have, severe weather events. We'll always have predictable people that do terrible things to their trees, like topping. We're always going to have to remove trees for certain defects or certain reasons. But if we can do our best to mitigate in all the other trees, I think we're really going to come out ahead and be proactive. I also wanted to mention that the science and technology is continuing to evolve. We're getting different things like the resistograph and the sonic tomography. We're looking at air spading. So we're going to more and more, we're going to know what's going on with these trees and make really make more data-driven and informed decisions when it comes to protecting those trees. With that, I am just going to say, please don't run away from tree risk and own it. We can do this. We can manage it. And it's definitely a risk. Trees are worth it if we do it right.
Thanks,
I'm sorry to leave too many times for questions, but I'm happy to stick around.
If you have a couple minutes,
absolutely.
We have about 9 questions. So feel free to open up your Q&A window. Meredith, go ahead and do that, and then you can see them at the very top. I'm going to launch a poll for all of the folks that are still with us to just take that quickly before you leave for the day. Thanks for joining us. And Meredith, you want to start? Can you see those questions? Did you?
I can. Okay. So I'll clip through. Greg, as an arborist, I have a responsibility of telling my tree owner that they have a duty of care. Yeah. So when you go out to a property, you have a responsibility to tell your client what you know. So, if you're looking at a tree that has a risk, you have a duty of care to tell them that that tree has a risk. if that tree, you know, as far as you need to let them know that they have a responsibility to manage that tree, but then what they do with that information is up to them. As basically, if they're the owner of the tree, they have to make the decision on what their action is going to be. But yeah, I would encourage you to let them know that they have a responsibility to manage for that duty of care, that they have the responsibility to assess their trees and to inspect them and act if there's a problem.
Great. Right-of-way trees next. You see that?
Many cities require adjacent property owners to maintain the trees and palms in the right-of-way. Many property owners are not aware of this. What's the consensus? Yeah, so this is something that comes up all of the time, and I think more cities are having these conversations. Who's responsible for managing the right-of-way trees? And it usually doesn't come up until there's a risk issue. And then people want to know, well, that tree's the city's, you got to pay thousands of dollars to remove that tree because that's not on me, or the tree fails. And then they have to say, well, you know, that's the city's negligence, not the resident's negligence. So the different case studies are going to look at different things. From my experience, my perspective, the city has a duty of care to inform if there's a risk. And if there's a risk associated with tree on the right of way, you have the required duty of care to let them know that that's a public safety risk. If you have a policy in place that says that the resident is then responsible, and you notify and you have a program associated with that, then that can potentially limit your liability. But all of that said, again, I'm not a legal expert. All of that said, people are going to want to sue a city versus suing an individual person. So you want to make sure you connect with your legal team and make sure that your system is robust enough to handle whatever kinds of possible scenarios might come up in your your ordinance program.
Greg has another question about trunk taper. Do you want to read it out loud so the folks can see it?
Yeah, trunk taper, trunk flare, root flare, expanded above ground root plate, and surface rooting can be normal or indicator of structural issues. Similar to Luli's book on tree fungi, is there a photographic book showing examples of trunk and flares that are okay or that need further investigation? That's a good question, not that I know of. A lot of times those trunk flares are a response to a particular site scenario. So you'll see bigger trunk flares in areas that maybe have a restricted root zone. They might have bigger root plates in certain areas. So I don't know that there's a catch-all associated with that. I wouldn't know that one, so sorry.
We still have 376 people joining us, so maybe if somebody has a reference, they could type that in the chat window.
Absolutely.
Great.
How useful are resistograph measurements? My impression is that resistographs are difficult to use and the outputs are difficult to interpret. It's the case that trees I have seen are found out to be a problem using the resistograph. Yeah, so the resistograph is an interesting tool. I also have had that experience where it's not necessarily telling us something that we don't already know. My feeling on the resistograph is that it's a really wonderful educational tool. When you as a trained arborist looking at something can say, I obviously know there's a defect there, that's a problem, and we need to act on it. City officials, elected folks, public doesn't know what's in your mind. They can't see that. But when you can create a printout with a resistograph, the bar chart the lines that show exactly where the defect is, then all of a sudden you have proof in a way. You have something that you can communicate that says, see, I told you there's a defect here, and now look at this, it's saying there's a defect. So I think that those kinds of tools sometimes communicate more to the non-tree folks and help kind of justify whatever course of action you're willing to take. Because you don't always necessarily even know where to put that resistograph or the drill. You might drill and completely miss where the defect is in the tree. If you're just looking to prod around to see if there's a hollow or a problem in the tree. So typically we're using those to justify some of the things we already know. But I've seen it be a really great tool.
Mark Porter had a suggestion: See Strategies for Reducing Infrastructure Damage Caused by Tree Roots by Dr. Larry Costello. So if anybody's interested in that reference, just scroll up through your chat window and it's up there.
Awesome, thank you. Problem I've encountered is that track is seen by many as one-time event. What protocols would you recommend for monitoring moderately risky trees that may become more risky over time? So I think that level 1 assessment, and Jace, I don't know where you're coming from and what size of a resource you're managing, but once you do even a level 2 assessment, or if you hire out for a tree inventory and you have had a 360 risk assessment on all of the trees, then following through, doing a level 1 walkthrough of a particular campus or particular street segments, having a routine for how you kind of maintain and monitor those risks is a good indication. Then once you see something that triggers kind of a question from that level 1, then you can jump into doing more advanced, level 2 or level 3 assessments to confirm what those risks are. So that's a good way to do it. Keep your eyes open. I missed the Kent State study in my notes. What was significant about that? Oh, the Kent State study, it was really talking about it talks about wind failure, tree deaths associated with, people deaths associated with tree failures and wind events. And I can share that link. I might have it somewhere.
Meredith, you can send me a list of links if you want, and then I can send it out to the people that registered.
Okay.
So you don't have to worry about it.
Okay, but yeah, it's an interesting study. It really focuses around wind events, so a lot of hurricane damages, but it breaks down the demographic of person that, it's certain type of people and where they are when they get killed. A lot of people are damaged on the road, tree failures into the road, a lot of mobile home problems. So it just kind of gives a little bit more information, especially for that East Coast and kind of Florida area. It's a cool resource to look at where tree failures are really impacting people. Where about in Provo? I need to visit this tree. It's at I think it's at the City Hall, right, Megan?
I didn't know about it until you told me about it.
Somebody in Utah posted on where that tree is. It's a wonderful tree. It's in a government building. And they've done a wonderful job of protecting. And it's a great example of a tree that could very easily have been something that people were like, whoa, that tree is dangerous. And the city has really embraced it in a way that they're now welcoming people to sit under it. And it's become kind of an icon for the city versus something that people have a problem with.
How cool. Oh, the elm tree in Provo. Yeah, okay.
Information. Sorry, go ahead.
Feel free to answer as many or as little questions as you want. So we have 5 more, but if you need to go.
No, this is fine. I'm happy to stick around. I'm sorry that my talk went a little bit too late, but
no worries.
As far as ADA sidewalk designs, this is something that's been on my mind a lot. Here in the St. Louis area, where a lot of people are redoing a lot of their ADA sidewalk plans, their strategic plans for the next 5 or 10 years. And so we're seeing a lot of investment in sidewalks because of the ADA requirements. And I'm racking my brain to figure out how we can tie tree preservation into that conversation and that dialogue. So much of what trees do for our communities, and the vulnerable populations that need safe sidewalks also need safe trees. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for our industries to really embrace the American Disability Act and the people that are kind of driving that bus, and hopefully get on the same bandwagon so we can serve those folks a little bit better and minimize a lot of the risk. So I think that there's a win to be had in all of that, but I haven't quite figured it out. The most surprising failure that I have come across, that one that I mentioned with the hackberry really shook me because the tree was perfect. Everything about the tree was perfect, and it just came over the roots, just completely rotted out. The reality is most of the tree failures aren't necessarily surprising. Most of them, when you go back and have you have the ability to look at the autopsy, so to speak, you can kind of say, oh yeah, that makes sense. This failed because of X, Y, and Z. And now we're starting to see a lot more really severe weather. So I think maybe that would be the answer. Some of these failures that are atypical, where a tree is seemingly healthy and just completely uproots or snaps off, those are, I think, surprising in that the trees just haven't been subjected to some of the severe weather that we're seeing, specifically here in the Midwest, snow loads and ice storms and wind loads and those sorts of things. Have you had experience with legal responsibility for trees that are planted between the street and the sidewalk? Removal cost is shared by half the city and half. Yeah, so kind of that question goes back to who's responsible for those right-of-way trees. And every city is going to do it differently. Most of the cities, well, it really depends. A lot of cities will take complete responsibility for those right-of-way trees and remove them as part of their risk management program and their public safety, or they'll kind of, the municipal government will turn into sort of a tree police where they have their code enforcement out on the streets looking for trees that may be dead, and then they inform residents that it's their responsibility to remove it. I think one of the biggest problems with that is that a lot of the code enforcement folks that are charged to identify risk trees aren't necessarily trained in looking for the defects that arborists would be able to identify. So it's probably a low bar for identifying hazard. They're either going to say it's dead and you have to take it out, but they're not going to necessarily be able to be proactive about mitigating branch failures and different things that aren't completely dead.
Salvador asked, knowing how construction affects tree health, are there programs in place to spread the knowledge to construction companies? Meridith mentioned a webinar that Nina Bassick did for our program in December, so feel free to check out our website and look for that webinar recording. Do you want to pick like one or two more questions, Meridith, and then we'll wrap up? You can sort of pick from whichever list you think, but Marty says we miss you here in Utah, Meridith.
It's so fun to see all these familiar names popping up in here. Let's see, the tree risk failure database, someone mentioned that. I think that's a great resource. Something that we didn't really talk about, but when you're looking at tree risk, species does play a big role in it. We know a lot about different species and how resilient they are to defects, how well they compartmentalize, how vulnerable they are to a lot of pathogens. So that tree failure database has a lot of good information about different tree species and how they may or may not respond to some of the defects. So I definitely think that that's an important one. Do you believe level 1 risk assessments associated with street tree inventory is enough for municipalities? So maybe I'll end with that. I think ultimately every municipal government has to decide what's enough for them. Industry standard, I would say, typically leans toward a modified level 2 for tree inventory risk assessments. It gives you a full picture of what's going on in that tree. With a level 1, you're likely going to be missing sidewalk damage. You're going to likely miss a lot of the defects that could potentially be impacting pedestrians if you're doing a windshield survey. So I think in a municipal setting, it would be appropriate to invest in a modified level 2, at least a 360, at least for an initial, and then redo those depending on how diligent you are at keeping that up. You know, redo those every 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Meredith.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me out here. This has been delightful.
Monty Stewart shouts out to you. We really do miss you. So anyways, thank you so much. We'll see everybody back here on Tuesday for another webinar on salt and urban trees. Sorry about the clicking in the background. That's my heater trying to keep me from freezing. And
I'm going to be hugging my space heater right here. You can't see it, but it's keeping me warm too.
I'm sure of it. And everybody have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much. Over and out. Bye, everybody.